Hey guys, I just wanted to go ahead and make a video today, basically just going over obviously the recap of today's action, but I also kind of wanted to make a another video lesson on gap strategies on the daily chart and how to kind of predict key support and resistance levels ahead of time using these strategies. I think earlier this week or last week, I made a video kind of going over gap strategies, but I just kind of wanted to touch up on that and give you guys some more examples. Um, Before I do that, though, I'll just go ahead and go over some of the action from today just to go over the recap. In terms of small caps, gapping up in pre market and small cap stocks in play. The last few days, it's been a little bit slower for small cap trades. It's been a little bit more focused towards mid cap and large caps. And as you guys know, the last couple days we've had a lot of range and volatility in SPY. So a lot of the attention has been with like things in large caps such as earnings and volatility with SPY. Therefore, when that happens, sometimes small caps slow down a bit. So just to go over some of the action from today, we did have WKHS on the watch list. Basically, 520 was that key level from yesterday. So on the watch list, I was basically saying for any long setups, we need to reclaim that 520. If we can't reclaim that 520, to look for a breakdown and short setups. And we ended up gapping down in pre-market today. And as you can see, we never even really tested that 520 area, and we actually formed a nice wedge and trendline break through this 470 area. So really nice short opportunity. I wasn't expecting this big of an unwind, but I think this 1 million share dump right here. I think that was due to like a tweet or some type of news. I'm not really positive on that. So, anyways, that was WKHS. Another gapper from this morning was CANF. On this one, I kind of mentioned we have this daily chart support or resistance level at 340 right here on this line. So if you notice in pre-market, I was also saying 340 was the key level. So for any long setups, it's the same as always. We have to find support over this 340 area due to that daily chart. And we kind of just rejected 340. And then if you look at the volume bars, we rejected 340 with huge volume. And then the rest of the day, the volume just completely died, and we just got an all-day fader on CANF. So that was actually a decent short opportunity. Another one was IZEA. This was another small cap that kind of popped up and then faded the rest of the day. So if you go to the daily chart, you'll notice we do have a lot of resistance near the 65 cent level, and that's kind of where we topped out and then faded. So IZEA, that was another gapper. AVEO, this one kind of had a big move in pre-market and then just kind of traded sideways all day. AVEO, SPWR, this was another one that we were watching. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one right at the moment just because I'm going to go over a few things on SPWR involving the gap strategies. Um, what else was there? MCEP was another one that I was kind of keeping on watch. I wanted it to kind of reclaim the 75 cent level and set up for a long. But if you look at the volume pretty much died down throughout the middle of the day. So we can still keep this on watch for tomorrow above the 75 cent level on MCEP. MYGN was another one you guys were watching, and Ruby. So that's pretty much gonna do it for the recap for today. What I wanted to really go over was some gap strategies from the daily chart that I kind of talked to you guys about before. So SPWR. First thing I'll kind of show you guys is the daily chart, right? So today's lesson is basically just going to involve the daily chart gaps. If you notice, there's a huge on this day right here in 2016, it basically gapped down, and in pre-market or after hours, it had a gap down. So when that happens, when you look on the daily chart, that's where you get this gap from. And typically in after hours and pre-market, there's a lot less volume traded. So these gaps really don't have too much volume or resistance. So here's kind of where this comes to play, right? So when this gaps down, this is how you determine a gap breakout, right? So this gap down, and now the high of this candle is 1098, right? So 1098 would be the gap breakout level to potentially fill this gap above. um, so that's basically what a gap breakout is. It's when a stock gaps down, you know, spends time down here, and then if it finds support and breaks out from this resistance, then it's technically in a gap fill zone to possibly fill this gap above, right? So this would be a daily chart breakout if this 1098 is crossed. So we'll kind of fast forward. It did end up having a gap breakout right here. As you can see, it passed this line. So it had a gap breakout, but it turned out to be a fake out, and then ended up, gapping down a few days later. Um, so that's just an example of a gap breakout or a gap fake out. So here's where it comes into play today, right? So technically, the high of day on this candle right here, and I'll put a highlight on that. This candle is technically the new gap breakout candle, right? Because if you zoom out the daily chart, this is the highest candle closest to this gap. So this is a new gap breakout level. If you zoom into there, the price is at 12. The high of day on this is 1279, right? So remember that price, 1279. That is the gap breakout price to fill this gap above right here, right? So what kind of happened is in after hours yesterday, if you remember that gap breakout price, it was at exactly 1279, right? So we actually ended up getting a gap breakout on the daily chart in after hours. And so that's just a way to kind of tell a uh, if a level is significant, is you can use those daily chart gap breakout levels to see if they hold as support, and then if they do hold as support, you can look for a potential gap fill on the daily chart. So um, just to kind of repeat myself, we had that gap breakout, it filled that gap above, and then it bounced exactly off of that gap breakout price near 1279. So hopefully this is kind of starting to make sense. Another thing that you need to do is, so once you get that gap breakout price, your next target would basically be this gap fill area. So a few things you want to do is you want to be looking at this candle, right? Because this candle is the daily chart gap fill candle. If if it breaks out from this candle or whatever the last high was, our price target basically would be the gap fill. So how do you find the gap fill price? You basically go to this candle and you can look at the high of day on it, which was 1540. So you could put a trend line at 1540. You also want to put the low of day price, which was 1468, and then the closing price, which was 1478. So now that you have those three prices kind of drawn on your trend line, then you can go to the 1 minute, and you'll notice after we had that gap breakout on the daily chart through 1279, we actually filled the gap above on the daily chart at that 1470 level, right? So if you go to the daily chart, on this gap fill candle, the closing price is 1478, and you go to the 1 minute charts, and in pre-market you'll see it filled that gap at 1478 almost to the penny, and then it had a reversal to that pre-market breakout price, and then it ended up bouncing off of that and kind of finding support. So if you guys read the watch list from last night, you'll notice I mentioned SPWR will keep on watch, filled daily chart gap around 1478. And I basically said we will see if we can retest this area tomorrow, or if it's weak, we can look for the breakdown. So we filled the gap. There's a few things that can happen when you fill a gap on the closing price on the daily chart. It can either close that gap and have a reversal, which it did right here. It closed that gap, had a reversal, or we can end up reclaiming that key level, and then you can actually look for long setups based on that gap closing level. So let me erase this bottom one. So as you can see, we have 4 different lines, right? This line represents the gap breakout on the daily chart. This represents the closing price on the daily chart gap fill candle, and the low of day price, and the high of day price on this candle right here. So hopefully that's starting to kind of make sense. I'll kind of repeat it one more time. So if you have a gap here, you want to find the highest candle right here. So out of all of this consolidation, the highest candle is right here, and that was at around 1279. So therefore, this 1279 is going to be the gap breakout to fill this gap above. So 1279, and then for the gap fill candle, the closing price was 1278, and the high of day price was around 1540. So those are what those lines represent, right? So basically we had a gap breakout through this 1279 area. On the 1 minute chart, we had a gap breakout. We closed the daily chart gap fill closing price, had a reversal, bounced off that breakout price, and then ended up breaking out again. So those are the kind of the 4 prices you can use to determine the gap breakout, the gap fill, and then you can basically use those price levels to determine things. So if you notice the 1540 right here, this was the high of day price, 1540, and that just so happened to be one of the biggest support levels of the day was that 1540 area. We once we broke through that, we bounced off it, you know, right here, right here, right there, and right there. So what you guys can do is you can go to mod only alerts and commentary, go to that channel and just check out my commentary on SPWR. Basically, I was looking for this 1550 to break down for the short setup in the afternoon, and basically I got that level from these support levels here, but I'm also using levels off the daily chart gap fill candle. So sorry guys, I know I kind of ranted there, and I might have explained that not in the best way, but I'll give a few more examples of what I just explained. So RUBI, this is another example of gaps on the daily chart, right? So yesterday, you'll notice on the daily chart, the first thing I really see is we do have this gap right here So the high of day on this candle was 786, right? So we have 786 is the gap breakout level. The reason for that is because we have this gap down, we have this gap right here. We have this gap right here from this drop, right? So the highest candle from this gap at this point in time is this candle right here. So all you do is take the high of day price, which is 786, and then from there you can kind of draw your trend line around that 786 area. And then from there, once we're in that gap breakout territory, you can also draw your lines on this gap fill candle. So like I was saying before, the gap fill candle is a candle um, from the gap down, right? So the day before the gap down, it's this candle right here. So what you do is you take the low of day on this candle, the gap fill candle, and that happens to be 832. The closing price is 839, and the high of day is 859. Okay, so let's just zoom out again on RUBI, right? We have a gap breakout from 780 to fill this gap above on the daily chart. So you have this gap from here to right here, right? All this space. So therefore, we have our four lines. We have the gap breakout line, we have the gap fill candle up here with the low of day on this, the closing price, and the high of day. Now that we've done that, if you'll notice, we go to the 1 minute charts. Um, so you'll notice the breakout was from yesterday's high. And this breakout kind of happened in after hours or pre-market. So we have that gap breakout candle or that gap breakout line right here. And then you'll notice at the open, what price did we hold? These two lines, they are the low of day or the low of day and the gap closing candle of the daily chart right here, right? So you'll notice that at the open, we kind of dipped down and we held that gap fill candle closing price perfectly and then actually ended up having a breakout. So that's kind of how I use those gap fill levels to kind of tell if this is going to be a significant support level. And if you want to go even deeper into this, you'll notice that if we hold this gap right here, if we hold the high of day on this, which is 860, then you can actually look for the next gap to fill, right? So if you want to go even deeper, you can draw your price level on the next gap breakout. So the next gap breakout is 995. That's the high of day on this candle. And you'll notice there's a gap to fill on the daily chart. The low of day on this candle is at 1329. So we'll put a line right there. Um, Let me just pull that up. So you'll notice once we had this gap breakout right here near this $8, we filled this gap above on the daily chart. So we had a gap breakout here, we filled this daily chart candle, and we actually held this candle as support near this 830 right here. So if you see a gap fill candle hold as support, the next thing you can do is draw your next resistance and support levels. So this stock just happens to have multiple gaps to fill on the daily chart. So since this daily chart gap fill candle held as support, the next major level is the next gap breakout level, which will be $9.95. And next gap, so if we hold $9.95, the next gap to fill is all the way near this $13, right? So just to kind of put that on the 1 minute, we broke out of this gap breakout. We held the next gap closing price, and then we went to the next gap, which was at this 990 area, right? So all these levels that I marked out based on those gap breakouts and those gap closing prices, you'll notice that they were major support and resistance levels on the 1 minute chart. So basically, to keep things really simple, we're now holding. Currently, we're in this gap zone right here, right? From here to here, we're holding over this gap. So technically, as long as we're over this $9.90, this is a bullish chart as long as it holds this support level. If you go to the 1 minute, that support level is right here. So we can actually keep this on watch for continuation to potentially fill that gap above near 13. So hopefully that kind of makes sense a little bit more. I know I'm kind of rambling and saying the same things over and over, but it's just to kind of drill it into your head. So let me see if I can kind of pull up a few more examples. SMSI. So here's another example. As you guys know, we've been watching SMSI for the last week or so. So I just want to show you guys another example of SMSI. So looking at this daily chart, we do have a few gap breakout levels. So 350, was a pretty significant level on the daily chart on this one. But what I want to point out on SMSI is just the gap strategy that we've been talking about. So if you look right here, it's kind of hard to see. Right there. I'm gonna zoom in a second, but this gap right here, before this huge run up, this gap right here was the closest daily chart gap that hasn't been retested. So for example, like right here, this is a gap, right? So this was a gap at 270, which ended up getting filled on this day, right? So we have this gap right here. So now if we zoom out, the next gap we have is right here. So let me draw the trend lines or the price level. So the gap is right here. This gap in between 727 and 728. You'll notice there's a gap right here. So what you can do is you can take the low of day on this candle, which is 469. You can take the closing price, which is 472. And then you can take the high of day price, which is 504, right? So what you want to look for when you have a gap like this on the daily chart is you want to have that drawn out. So we know that we have a gap to fill on the daily chart at 470. So there's two things that can happen once this gap fills. Once this gap fills, it can have a bearish reaction towards 470 and then have a reversal and then make its way down, or it can hold this gap fill level and set up for a long, right? So here's where we can kind of zoom into the 1 minute and I can show you guys a very good example of that, right? So 470 was the 468 to 470. That was the gap fill candle closing price. So 470, you go to the daily charts, you'll notice 470 was that level right there. So whenever you see a daily chart gap closing price hold as support, that's when you can look for long setups. So you'll notice the day that we gapped up, we rejected that 470, pulled back, and then throughout the day, we actually reclaimed that gap closing price, bounced off it a few times, and confirmed as solid support. And then you'll notice it had a breakout. So you'll notice it had a breakout from that price, and then it actually held that high of day price, which was at the high of day of this was at 504, and on the 1 minute that price was at, you'll notice once it hit 504, that also proved as a solid support level. So I think that's all I'm going to go over today. I just kind of wanted to go over the gap breakout price, and the gap closing price. So make sure if you guys see gaps on the daily chart, just to mark those out and just kind of test the strategy out and let me know what you guys think.